One, two, three, four. Can you folks hear me? All right, great. Fantastic, fantastic. Hi, how are you?
Good evening, Pastor. Good to see you again.
Thank you so much. Great to have you here.
A delight.
Do you listen to jazz music?
Jazz music, yes.
Okay. So I was playing some jazz in the background while waiting for you.
Sure. In fact, you know, jazz music has some, at a fundamental level, commonalities with Indian music, Indian classical music.
Are you serious?
Yes, because in jazz, there is no written music sheet. So the music is created on the spot.
Wow.
Based on really a dynamic alignment among the musicians that are playing. And similarly, in Indian classical music, you have the tabla, which is the drums, and the sitar, which is the string instrument, and there could be more than one a person on the drums. I mean, there are more than one drum, and there is no written music. So it's ongoing. It's almost like a dialogue, real-time dialogue, and who is in the lead among the musicians can shift, and it's not defined in the beginning.
Wow.
And the same thing in jazz.
That's quite interesting. When last were you in India?
Say again, please.
When last were you in India?
When was I last in India?
Yeah. When last were you?
Yes, I was in India in November.
Ah, okay.
Yes, I was going to go in March, but then obviously the virus and the flights and all of that.
But I hear India is hard hit now.
Yes, yes. So India is not a good situation. Per capita basis, it's not as bad as US or Brazil. But in terms of the total number of cases, it is pretty bad. Of course, the other thing is that the total number of cases may be, let's say, undercounted, not because the government is, let's say, not telling the truth, but just because, you know, especially in rural India, there is extremely inadequate testing.
Okay.
Yes.
But at some point, I thought India had it under control. But it seems to have spiked recently.
Initially, yes. Initially. So what happened is that sometime in early March, Modi was one of the earliest to impose extremely tight lockdown. He did that. But obviously, when you do that kind of a lockdown, the economy suffers. And then about 5 weeks into it, then he started opening up. And it might well have been premature opening. Because there is a lot of migrant labor. And so when the lockdown happened, the migrant laborers, they were all basically had to be in the towns where they were. So they didn't have any job, but the government made sure that food, etc., got provided to them. But they were under lockdown. And then, but they wanted to go home to their villages in other provinces. And so once the lockdown lifted, so they all scattered. And so the concern is that as they scattered to the rest of India, especially rural India, that's where it's probably increasing now.
Wow.
Yes, so it's a tough situation. It won't really come under control until there is a decent vaccine. I mean, not just that there is a decent vaccine or more than one, but also that it is manufactured and available in large enough quantities. So, yeah, I mean, the good thing is that India is the world's largest manufacturer of vaccines. So there is enough domestic production capacity, but it takes time.
Did you say India is the largest manufacturer of vaccines?
Yes, indeed, indeed. Yeah, in fact, the bulk of the vaccines around the world are manufactured in India. And
Wow.
the single biggest company that already has been for years manufacturing more than 1 billion vaccines a year is something called Serum Institute of India, but it's a company, yes. And
that's interesting, man.
Right, and the leading candidate right now is from Oxford University, and Oxford and AstraZeneca, and they have already entered into a production agreement with a manufacturer in Italy for the developed markets and a manufacturer, Serum Institute of India, for the emerging markets.
Wow.
So, but I understand Nigeria and actually much of Africa has so far been spared from, let's say, a disastrous flare-up.
Yes, we've been spared. I mean, South Africa is the worst hit, but West Africa is doing fine, and East Africa is doing much better. So if this holds out, which we hope it does, then it must mean that there is something within the systems of people that live in that territory that has developed some resistance.
Yes, yes.
I mean,
yes.
my mother is 87 years old, and she tells me she tested positive, but it didn't get into her bloodstream, and she has antibodies. So there must be something I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, there is a fairly widespread belief among the scientists that that immunity to a different coronavirus, for example, SARS or others, confers some degree of immunity to all coronaviruses. So that's sort of the concept of innate immunity. And among the various vaccine development efforts underway, the most, let's say, the best ones are trying to attack not just COVID-19, but the common root of the coronavirus itself, so that the immunity is longer lasting and broad-based.
That's great. So we'll be starting in the next 1 minute.
Yes. Yes.
We'll be kicking off then.
Yeah.
Make sure we're all good. Everything is working fine. And we good.
And by the way, I mean, if it is being recorded, it's perfectly okay with me.
All right. All right then. All right, welcome all to this webinar. Thank you all for registering. We had over 3,200 people who have registered for this particular webinar. So I want to thank all of you that have come on and registered for this. Our guest this evening is no stranger, really. We all know him if you have been associated with the platform in any way, and also, so he's a friend of the house. His name is Professor Anil Gupta, and he's widely recognized as one of the world's leading experts on strategy, globalization, and emerging markets. Gupta is ranked as number 28 on the Thinkers 50 list of the world's most influential management thinkers. He has been named by The Economist as one of the world's superstars research on emerging markets in a cover story on innovation in emerging economies. He serves as a consultant, advisor, keynote speaker, board member, and chair with some of the largest corporations in the world, including IBM, National Semiconductor, Marriott, First Data, Jacobs Engineering, Indian Oil, Huawei Technologies, and a couple of others. Today he'll be speaking on the subject of where all new business models, where they come from. So I will give the floor now to Professor Gupta. He'll speak for about 20 minutes, after which we will get into a question and answer session, which will be taking questions for about 40 minutes. All right then. Thank you very much. Professor Gupta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pastor, and very good to be with you again, and with all my friends in Nigeria. So good evening to all of you. So as Pastor said in the introduction, my topic is where do new business models come from? And this is something that in terms of my background on this topic is not just from research, but also for over 20 years, I have been an advisor in a couple of cases as a board member. I'm currently an investor in a technology ventures, primarily Silicon Valley, Bangalore, and Bangalore-based technology ventures. So this is a topic that I have seen up close, and I have been directly involved in. So when I think of business model innovation as a starting point, the way I look at business model innovation, it's two types, at a fundamental level. One is what we would say new to the world. So something like that never existed before. So that would be like Uber, which invented the ride-sharing phenomenon for the world, or let's say Google, its algorithm-based search, which was the first time that internet search took place in that way. But then there are, let's say, new to the local context, not new to the world. So for example, if we just look at ride sharing, now, of course, there is ride sharing by cars, like the Uber model, but then the localized versions of it is ride sharing like Gojek in Indonesia, or in fact, in Nigeria, like Gokara and others. So which are not new to the world, but new to the local context. Now, so obviously a question is, which one is more important? Well, both are important depending on how we look at it. So if we say, okay, who would be viewed as, let's say, the pioneer, the originator, almost like global Hall of Fame context, they're naturally new to the world innovation, like Apple, Steve Jobs and Wozniak launching the Apple computer, the whole personal computer industry back in 1977. That's clearly deserving of the Hall of Fame. But then if you look from a different lens, which is in terms of the social and economic impact of the business model, then in fact, there is no reason to look at only new to the world, because new to the local context can be as powerful as new to the world. And obviously, new to the local context, innovation requires a significant degree of localization. But just as an example, let's say not obvious example of new to the local context, let's look at, say, the anti-lock braking systems. Now, anti-lock braking systems actually were introduced to the world many decades back for aircraft because they need to come to a stop without skidding from a high speed. But then from aircraft, the anti-lock braking system went to commercial vehicles, trucks and buses. Then it went to cars. But when it went to cars, it first went to the high-end cars, the Mercedes and the BMWs of this world. Then from the high-end cars, it went to mass market cars. And now actually in recent years, anti-lock braking systems have come to motorbikes. So if we look at, new to the world versus new to the local context, there is no reason to believe that the introduction of ABS in the car industry is any less important than, say, to the airplane. So that's something to keep in mind when we think of new to the, what we mean by business model innovation. And new, or, in innov is about new, is new to what? And both are important. With that as a foundation, let me now turn to the main question. Where do business models come from? And so I look at the business model from, let's say, as a system of three main elements. Each element represents a choice that the company makes, and whether it's a large company or a small company. So the first element is, who are our target customers? Okay. So it's like, if you are Apple II back in 1977, who is the target customer? Is it the individual, the small business, the small shop, or is it the large corporation? So who is the target customer? Second, what customer value do we want to deliver to this target customer? And third is, how do we create and deliver this customer value to these target customers? So when we say, where do new business models come from, we are really actually talking about dramatic change, dramatic innovation in any one or more of these three elements. So let me take as examples to concretize the business model innovation. So let's take first a dramatic change in who the target customer is. Dramatic enough so that it actually calls us to think of it as really radical innovation. Okay, so of course Apple II, before Jobs and Wozniak launched Apple II computers, the customers were actually corporations. They were not individuals. Nobody even dreamed about individuals being target customers. So that would be an example. Think about Southwest Airlines in the US. Before Southwest Airlines was launched in early 1970s, people who flew airplanes were actually the middle or higher income people, because flight was still expensive. What Herb Kelleher, the founder of Southwest, he said, what I want to do is the person who is going to go on a motorbike from, say, Washington to New York or Boston to New York, I want to get that person, instead of on a motorbike, actually into an airplane. So converting a non-customer into a customer. GE launched Mac 400, which is, of course, an innovation coming from a large company. But Mac 400 is an ECG machine, and that was sold for just a few $100s. That was portable, that a doctor going to a rural market, rural area, rural town, village, could put that ECG machine in the trunk of his or her car. So therefore, it thought of the market customers for ECG machines, not just as hospitals, but actually as individual practitioners who could buy one and use that in the back of his or her car. From Africa, an example is a company such as from South Africa, Lumkani. So Lumkani, what it does is that it offers low-cost fire insurance to actually the owners of informal and low cost homes and businesses. And think about informal homes, which are basically in shanty towns. So they are completely ignored by the existing insurance companies. And what Lumkani did is to invent, actually, technologically first, an Internet of Things based sensor that would detect not actually smoke, but the change in temperature. And apparently it works very well. And then so it sold that. And on top of that, as a additional service, if you will, that if you want to buy, then it added fire insurance, where in fact, then it's all connected through mobile technology and internet, so that the company, the monitors, the insurance people, the homeowner, if the homeowner is away, can be informed right away if there is a problem. So converted non-customers for home insurance into customers. Think about, for instance, from Kenya, an example is Copia. So Copia has created an e-commerce platform for rural customers, because rural customers often suffer from two constraints. They may not have internet connectivity. Second, the logistics in terms of how do you get the goods to the small village in the rural market, and it gets very expensive. And what Copia did is to use, in fact, create this platform and use community-based agents who then take orders on behalf of the customer, who receive the supplies, and who do the local delivery, or the customer goes and picks up from that agent. So that instead of, let's say, to 100 families, you actually are the company is dealing with only one entity. So you solve these kinds of problems, And so these are examples of dramatic rethinking of who the target customer for this product or service could be. Let me come to the second type of business model innovation, and that offers, obviously, in some sense, even bigger opportunities for creating new ventures, de novo, coming straight out of the blue, or by large companies, but both, and which is a dramatic reconceptualization of customer value. Now here, let's assume, in fact, that the customer is this pre-existing customer. So there is no dramatic innovation on who the target customer should be or could be. But the innovation is really in rethinking customer value. From a large company example, let's think about Apple. Now this time, not about the computer, Apple II, but about the iPhone, the smartphone. So smart iPhone was the first smartphone in the world that actually had the apps, the App Store. So that the primary purpose of the iPhone is not that you can make phone calls, obviously you can, but the primary purpose is that it's actually a computer that is a mobile device, okay? And that has all of those capabilities. So before that, the Nokia, with the dominant player. So the whole idea was that the mobile phone is primarily for voice. iPhone's notion was that the primary reason is data and not voice. It's the smart in the smartphone that's more important than the phone part in a smartphone. So reinventing, reconceptualizing. Think about Uber, okay? Obviously, customers for taxi services have existed for decades. Taxi services existed, obviously, but what Uber did was to reconceptualize dramatically a taxi service into a ride-hailing service. Okay, so those details are obviously very well known. An interesting example. So I was reading, in fact, what are the innovations taking place in Africa, in Nigeria, and how what kind of interesting examples they throw up in terms of business model innovation. Is a company from Nigeria is Tizeti. And Tizeti, as I understand from a Fast Company article, is that they have created solar-powered 4G LTE towers, which then provide unlimited broadband mobile internet at less than 50% of the cost of competitors. Okay, so obviously, if you can provide unlimited broadband internet data at less than 50% the cost, that's a dramatic reduction in the price to the customer. And you are doing that actually through this mechanism. Another example from Nigeria in terms of rethinking customer value. This is a case of taking a global innovation or new to the world innovation, applying it to a local context. For instance, a Kobo 360, which is obviously Uber type delivery services now using trucks, and where what Kobo 360 does, as I understand, is to provide basically a bigger bundle of solutions to the driver. So you get more supply into the market. The demand exists, but how to increase the supply? By providing working capital finance, by providing vehicle insurance, and various other things that would induce drivers to actually be part of the Kobo 360 network. Or very interesting example is Zipline from Rwanda, which is using actually battery-powered drones, ultra low cost, to deliver essential, urgent medical supplies to remote areas. Customers existed from before, no innovation there, but it's really how do you get medical supplies to them in a matter of minutes, okay? Maybe less than half an hour instead of several hours, because these are urgent, essential medical supplies. Khan Academy, obviously, we know, right? Market for education exists, but how Khan Academy brings that education is dramatically new as compared to what alternatives existed. The final part of this opening, let's say, commentary, if you will, is the third element of business model innovation. But first, to recap. So as I said, business model, I think of it as a system of three elements. What customer is getting, and if you make a dramatic innovation in rethinking who the target customer could be, that offers massive entrepreneurial opportunities. It's like Apple thinking of individuals as being customers for computers rather than only corporations, as just one of many examples. The second element is what customer value do we want to deliver to these targeted customers? And any dramatic conceptualization there offers massive opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. An example, a global example would be Uber in terms of ride sharing. But then, of course, there are many examples in Africa that I talked about, for instance, the Zeti, Kobo 360, Zipline, and so on. The third element is how do we create and deliver the customer value? Now, how do we create and deliver the customer value? Let's just call it value chain re-engineering. But here I'm not talking about micro improvement, incremental improvement. I'm talking about radical re-engineering. Okay, so the customer may not be different from before. Even the customer value may not be dramatically different from before. But what is different is how that value is created and delivered. A global example would be IKEA. IKEA in furniture. So obviously, customers for furniture for IKEA or for before IKEA and after IKEA are the same, no change. The customers, what they're buying from IKEA is tables and chairs and beds and dressers and so on, no change. There's nothing dramatically different. Yeah, IKEA furniture is slightly different looking. But what's really different is how IKEA goes about designing, manufacturing, and delivering that furniture. Because historically, furniture is very bulky. And so therefore, no matter where in the world we are talking about, US or Nigeria or India or anywhere else, traditionally, furniture is manufactured close to the point where it's consumed because it's very bulky. So to consume furniture in Washington, DC, maybe it gets manufactured in South Carolina, but definitely not in Brazil. What IKEA did is to create flat packed furniture where design is such that it can be flat packed and it's relatively easy for the customer to assemble the furniture himself or herself. And what flat packing does is that now furniture can be manufactured in Poland or in Brazil or in Vietnam for actually purchase and consumption in Germany or in Washington, D.C. So it completely unlocked the geographic constraints, and in that process, dramatically reduced the cost structure for furniture. I mean, dramatically, I'm talking about 1/3 or even less. But other examples from Nigeria, an example is Helium Health. And I happen to be an angel investor in Helium Health. And what Helium Health does is use IT, technology, to actually essentially dramatically make it more manageable, more efficient, more expensive, more effective, the administrative aspects of healthcare. So services. So for instance, for providers, healthcare providers, electronic medical records, telemedicine, administration, financial management, payers, data transparency, cost efficiency, for the patients, personal health records, telemedicine, finding new healthcare providers, and so on. So these customers have existed, no innovation there. These services have been needed, they were well known, and they were being met in some fashion. But what Helium Health is trying to do, actually do it in a dramatically more effective and efficient and faster way. Okay, so the innovation is in the value chain engineering. An example from from the US is plenty. So I just take two examples, one from US and one from Nigeria. So the one from US is Plenty. So Plenty is actually a Silicon Valley based company, but it has nothing to do with information technology. And as it happens, Jeff Bezos, his own personal fund, is an investor. His own money is invested partly in Plenty. What Plenty does, it's in vertical farming. So, historically, when we think of farms, it's horizontal farms on land. But here, you take away the soil, you use hydroponics, and now you have a multi-story tower, which could be in the heart of San Francisco or New York City, where actually what it is a farm. And what you do in that process, you reduce the amount of water needed to less than 5%, okay? And so obviously the amount of land needed, you have dramatically, it's like, 1% or less. You have taken away a huge chunk of the labor cost. You have taken away a huge chunk of the logistics costs. But obviously, still there are other costs. For instance, of energy. It's a lot more energy intensive, vertical farming currently. So it's not that it's going to displace, if you will, land-based farming completely. But, again, like all innovations, it may take 15 years, like Tesla or SpaceX, to get from here to there. But that's the what. So therefore, obviously, customers for fruits and vegetables, there's nothing new there. What they're going to supply is tomatoes and whatever else, cabbage or whatever else people want to buy. Nothing new there. But what's really new is actually how that fruit and vegetable is produced. So it's the value engineering, dramatically different. An example from Nigeria would be this company called 54 Gene. And from what I understand, 54 Gene from their website and so on, and what's been written about them, is that Africa, and here I'm talking not just Nigeria, but Africa, is home to the world's most diverse, most heterogeneous genomic pool, okay, DNA pool. And so obviously that kind of heterogeneity in DNA pool is of massive value for scientific research, both academic and pharmaceutical. And what 54 Gene is doing is building a database of that kind of a genomics database and then make it available to actually researchers, academic and pharma company all around the world to accelerate, if you will, the development and testing of life sciences products. So once again, the market has, the customers are not new. Even the market is not new. The customer value is not dramatically different. But what's different is, that a company like 54 Gene has gone about collecting this data based in Nigeria, so within Africa, So again, to recap, business model, can be new to the world or new to the local context. Both kinds can have massive social and economic impact. 3 elements to the business model: who is the target customer, what customer value, and how do we create that customer value. Dramatic innovation in any one or more of these 3 elements provides massive opportunities for entrepreneurs while adding social and economic value. So with that, Pastor, I'm looking forward to a dialogue and Q&A on any topic.
All right. So I'll take a couple of questions. Should, in case any person has any question which is directly related. Now, let me repeat that: directly related with what you just heard, I need clarity on it. I will take the question to put it up, but it has to be directly related to what he has just said. Now, the first question I'm going to take that someone sent in is this. The person says, we know there are specific tipping points that signal the need for transition of models to business owners. Why are some businesses better able to identify and respond to these signals than others? And what skills and attributes do we need to cultivate to be able to scale and grow across multiple seasons? So the 2 questions talks about why some people are able to identify, better positioned to identify and respond to these signals. And then the second is, what skills and attributes do we need to cultivate to be able to scale and grow across the different types of seasons?
Yeah.
Business.
So very interesting question. So I take say 2 types of, let's say, this another word that people in the new venture community use is pivot. So is how do you pivot and how do you do so successfully? The big challenge, of course, is that both of the 2 extremes are true. If you're not committed to the business model, okay, then it's unlikely that you would succeed, because fundamentally, when we are talking about bold innovation, it means that it was not obvious to others, so you are a pioneer. And if you are a pioneer and it was not obvious, it's not going to be like a slam dunk success. There can be, but not always from the get-go, which means that you have to be committed to actually keep at it until you taste success. So that said, on the other hand, you can be going down into a dead end. And so if you are not willing to change, then actually you may have made a wrong bet. So how do you kind of solve this puzzle? And the key to solving this puzzle is to essentially be, in some sense, like two-faced, that you are committed, but at the same time you're open to change. And the sort of at a ground level, the trick is to keep conducting experiments. Okay, that if you changed, what may be new directions? Because if you are pivoting and you're letting go of the previous business model for the sake of the new one, unless you are sure that you're making the right choice, you may be going from from the frying pan into the fire. So therefore, even as you're pursuing the current business model, keep conducting experiments. Generally, the advice would be conduct a number of experiments, conduct them quietly so that it does not jeopardize the perceived commitment to your current business model, and learn. And then, once you have reasonable degree of confidence that the current business model doesn't work and you should pivot, you are ready to pivot. So that would be number one. The second kind of pivot actually is much less complicated. It still requires thinking, which is that where you're not abandoning your previous business model, but now you're diversifying, you're adding more complexity to it, okay, which could be new customer segments, new product lines, a bigger solution bundle, and so on. And so, just think about iPhone. So, the iPhone, when it was launched, first, it only had a few apps, and those few apps were made by Apple. So they did not have an app store, but it had the app capability. Then they added the App Store. So 2006, the launch of iPhone. 2007 is the launch of the App Store. Okay, so that's an example. Or you look at Uber that started out with ride sharing. But then now you have Uber Eats, for example, right? So or Uber Logistics and various other complexity. So the key in adding complexity is two things. And generally, companies, if they keep those two things in mind, are likely to do well. Number one is don't diversify in too many directions all at one time. Okay, so it's like you want to go from, say, 14 steps from ground floor to the first floor. And you don't want to be, jumping 5 steps at a time, because then you will stumble. It's like they're doing 5 things at the same time. But what you do, you go up 1 step at a time, but then do so rapidly. So which means that as you are going to make your business model complex by adding diversity, do so 1 variable at a time. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that as you are looking to diversify, to do it, related fields. Don't go into unrelated areas. And there are companies that go into unrelated areas and stumble. So it's like, if you're Uber in ride sharing, go into Uber Eats, okay, as an example. So you're going into related. If you're Apple and you are big in personal computers, you go into smartphones. Smartphone is nothing but a small computer. You don't go into making pharmaceuticals, for example. So with those two considerations in mind, actually, this kind of pivoting often is low risk.
All right, sir. There seems to be a question that I want to take, and this question here says, Professor, can you give some examples of value creation and reengineering for financial services industry? It seems relatively easier where fiscal products are involved, but for financial services, how do you both reconceptualize customer value and re-engineer the supply chain? So this person is asking about financial service industry.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, if you look at innovation in all of the different spaces, fintech is one of the most robust spaces where technological innovation is taking place, and starting from technology, obviously leading to business model innovation. Just as one example, there are many others. Let me take an example of a company from India. The company is Ziploan. Of course, they have competitors, so they are no longer the only venture. And so what Ziploan does, that it makes loans to either individuals or small businesses. And actually loans that are not backed by real collateral. So you don't have real assets backing the loan. Traditional banks, if you will, they would not give a loan to a small or medium business without the backing of hard assets. Okay, and so what that also means is that often either the interest rates are very high, or these customers are simply excluded from the formal lending market. And what Ziploan is doing is that these individuals or the small business, they do have a lot of, let's say, data about them in the social media space. So they have algorithms that use the social media data about the individual or about the small business to assess the credit worthiness of the individual. So it's a completely different approach to assessing credit worthiness. Now, it doesn't mean that the loan is available to these customers at the same extremely low rates as it may be available to, Reliance or one of the big giants. Obviously not. But loans are available at a dramatically, fundamentally lower cost, interest cost as compared to loan sharks. Okay, or as compared to people who simply would not, where loan simply would not be possible. But so it's not just that now they become eligible for loans and they become eligible for loans at a dramatically lower rate. But the approval process, because it's all based not on coming to your premises and figuring out what assets you have or meeting you in person, that the loan approval process often takes minutes or hours. Okay, often not more than 24 hours. So therefore, the speed at which so that's an example of how value re-engineering in the financial sector.
All right. Someone asks this question: excessive and unpredictable government regulations are a major concern of doing business in Nigeria. How do you navigate these and ensure your business model is resilient to policy and regulatory shocks, like banning, part of your value, the banning of part of your value chain activities?
Yeah. So, the regulatory shocks, unfortunately, or let's call them policy shocks, unfortunately, are becoming part and parcel of every country. True for Nigeria, but true very much for India or China or the United States, at least in recent years. So the question is actually of wider, greater importance than only for Nigeria. And my thinking on this is three things that the company should do. Number one is that you want to, of course, maintain dialogue with the policymakers. You may not be able to influence them, maybe you can influence them, but if not, at least you have an early signal of what kind of a policy shock is coming, so it gives you more time to prepare. Number one. Second is that companies actually build resilience in their business models. Give you two examples, one from China, one from India. So Federal Express, FedEx. So it used to provide domestic logistics services in China and obviously global. But the Chinese government decided that, okay, the domestic logistics is only for Chinese companies. So then what do you do as FedEx? What you do is that you then engage into a licensing agreement with domestic logistics companies. So they operate as if they are FedEx. So as far as the trucks are concerned and the website is concerned, no difference, still FedEx. But the actual operations are now done by a Chinese company. So for the customer, there's pretty much no difference, right? But the business model changes. Another example, a more recent one from India, is that I think it was last year in e-commerce. The Indian government said that multinational or foreign e-commerce players are no longer allowed to be retailers, meaning that Amazon, you cannot be a retailer, even an online retailer. Or Flipkart, which is owned by Walmart, you cannot be an online retailer. Well, okay, so in one sense, you can think, this is the end of the world as far as that market is concerned. But on the other hand, what Amazon and Flipkart, and of course, the government gave them a couple of months or something to, implement the new policies, is they, rapidly shifted from being retailers to being platforms, so that the merchants who are selling on the Amazon platform are Indian merchants, and on Flipkart, they're Indian merchants. And so what Amazon and Flipkart became are platforms. So as far as the customer is concerned, you're still buying from Amazon and you're still buying from Flipkart. It just happens that the goods that you're buying are not owned by Amazon or Flipkart. Still, Amazon is using its own warehouses, its own fulfillment centers, its own logistics services that are available. So this is the case of building resilience to a business model where it appears that you are dead, but actually you are very much alive and in compliant with the new regulations. And the third approach is actually, in some sense, that's higher risk, but not at the same level, either unethical or not feasible, which is to, let's say, cater to the bigger ecosystem that could be even more powerful than the policymakers, politicians. Uber is a good example. So what happened is that taxi services everywhere in the world are actually regulated by the local municipalities rather than by the national government. And the local municipalities often are captured, if you will, they're captives of the local taxi services. And so when Uber started spreading its wings around the world, in many cities around the world, including London and Paris and so on, the local authorities, they did various forms of essentially banning the Uber ride-sharing model, okay? Outright banning. But then what Uber did is that because the beneficiaries of the Uber service are the citizens, and the number of citizens is much larger than the number of taxi drivers or the politicians. And so what Uber did is essentially got the customers, if you will, in London and Paris and other places to start lobbying the local politicians that, hey, what you're doing is actually counterproductive for us, the citizens, and so on. And the politicians changed the regulations. They entered into a dialogue with Uber and said, okay, if you can meet XYZ conditions, everything is fine. And so, and it's about safety of, if you will, of passengers and so on. So that's a case of where it's a much more confrontational approach, but it can work if the service or product that you're bringing to the market has actually a wider, much wider ecosystem benefit. So that ecosystem essentially will rise up and defend you and work on your behalf to talk to the politicians.
Great answer, great. Quickly, this is a very straightforward question. The person says, leaders lead with a combination of strategy, data, and gut. To what extent is gut reliable?
Yeah.
So do you have it?
Yes. So, the thing is that actually, here, of course, we are talking about decision makers and we are talking about human decision makers.
Yeah.
And, so ultimately, of course, as compared to AI, and we know from AI is that the quality of the decisions or recommendations that an AI system might make is a function of the data on which the AI system has been trained. And in that sense, the AI system has no gut, okay? Now, so human decision makers, business leaders, that when they use information and analysis to come up with some decisions, but their gut tells them something different, okay? Obviously, if there is a perfect alignment or alignment between the gut and the, let's say, formal decision analysis, no problem. But the question is, if there is a disagreement between the two, what do you do? So, my first, if I find myself in that situation, my first assumption is to say, most likely, my gut is telling me that there is some information that has not been factored in, that my human brain, and that's why AI has not yet caught up with the human brain, is that the human brain has some other information or some other analysis that is not being factored in. Okay, and so therefore, what I would say, what does my gut tell me? And if my gut tells me something different, it's not that I would right away say, I go with my gut. Obviously, if I don't have the luxury of time, then given a conflict between rational analysis and gut, I would go with my gut, okay? But if we have the benefit of time, I would say, okay, let me see, what is my gut telling me and why is it telling me? And then I would have my people or myself gather more information, do more analysis, and figure out, what it is that we did not take into account, okay, that my gut is telling me. Now, the one part that we should be very careful about in relying on gut is kind of the cognitive aspects versus the emotional aspects, okay? The emotional aspect is, that I may be the type of person who is basically a high risk taker. In fact, irrational risk taker, if you will. I'm always willing to roll the dice. Or you have lots of people who are the opposite of it, that you do the analysis and the analysis say, hey, this is a great opportunity, but I lack the guts to act. I lack the guts to commit. So in that case, it's my emotions talking rather than my, let's say, cognition talking. And that I would be wary about, because if it's just one person making the decisions, there is high risk of going with emotions rather than with cognition. There actually have a team. And in fact, one approach that's strongly recommended that I know some companies have systematically used, which is that for instance, the CEO asks a task force to look at, okay, should we enter this country, okay, this market, and how? And so the task force comes up with recommendations, yes, no, and this is, say, if the answer is yes, this is how you do it. But before, let's say, going with that conclusion, what the CEO does is set up another task force and say, your goal is only to pick holes in this analysis, okay? And we may still disagree with when you pick holes, we may still go with the original recommendation, but that's not your goal. Your goal is not to defend what this team recommended. Your goal is actually to pick holes so that they are given the legitimate right, legitimate expectation to pick holes. And what you do, this is the devil's advocacy approach. And through that approach, you get a comprehensive, let's say, analysis, and then you make a decision. So that is one way to guard against the dangers of going with the emotional aspects of gut.
All right. The next question is, in your experience, what is the best way to assist with capacity building at government levels to support businesses to scale across these various models, i.e., government creates the regulatory landscape critical for businesses to thrive? Is there anything we can do or focus on so that government is a lot more equipped and invested in mainstreaming the support for growing businesses?
Yeah. So, on that question, so what happens is that, of course, the jury on one aspect is very much in, which is that if business people, so far it's been businessmen, not too many cases of businesswomen, that when businessmen have become political leaders, for instance, like the president of a country, their track record has been horrible, okay? And the reason is because they think that running the country is the same thing as running a business, which is absolutely not true, because you don't, profit maximization or shareholder value maximization is no longer the goal. And actually the stakeholders that you're dealing with are far more diverse and their goals are very different. And in fact, the power of the president is ultimately far more limited, power of the president of a country as compared to the president of a company. So therefore, there is division of labor, and politicians and policymakers, they do one type of thing that they excel at, and business people do another type of thing. But then, of course, the problem is that if we leave everything to the politicians, they don't have the business experience, and so therefore they may create grandiose policies, but actually they may not think through the implementation side of it. They may not think through the implications of their policies in terms of what happens on the ground. So they need, if you will, the expertise of the business people who know the second game very well. Now, there are two ways to do it. One is to bring in the cabinet maybe, or as part of the leadership team, people from industry. And so Obama did that very, very effectively, that he brought in people from Silicon Valley and elsewhere to actually hold senior positions in the government, okay? He did not bring in at the cabinet level, but I know, for instance, the chief scientific advisor, which was a full-time position, the chief data scientist for the US government, which was a full-time position. They were all people who came from industry, okay? So therefore, yes, they are now in policy positions, but they are always going to be mindful of the impact on the ground. That's one. The second approach is to set up, let's say, an advisory council. You can set up an economic advisory council or a scientific advisory council, and where you bring in people from industry so that you have the let's say access to their thoughts, so I think that's important.
All right, because of time, I'm gonna take 3 more questions. The first one I want to take is, I think it's a very good question. And this person says, for long, Apple has been reputed, that's Apple company, has reputed to adopt we know what is good for our customers approach to product development, which appears extremely inside out. Why are they so successful when most management theories claim that this approach is not very effective?
Yeah. So, I mean, the question is very good and very much on the mark, if you will, and because it's true that the general advice is listen to the customer. But Steve Jobs, he really didn't believe in market research, if you will. But I would say that the world has mortals and the world has gods, and Steve Jobs was one of the gods. so I mean, there are things that gods can do which mortals cannot do, at least not as well. So that's one thing. That's why when he passed away, the cover of Economist magazine called, Jobs the magician or Steve the magician, because he was like a magician, right? But there's more to it than that, which is that the Steve Jobs, I mean, he was born in Silicon Valley. So it's not just that he was a transplant to Silicon Valley. He was born and brought up in Silicon. So he was a hardcore product of that environment. And what he was doing actually is creating products for his friends, for the people who live in Silicon Valley. Now, it turns out that the business in which Apple operates, that if people in Silicon Valley love something, that is likely to be the leading edge rather than a niche. Leading edge for what the rest of the world will migrate to. So therefore, even though he was going by his gut, if you will, but his gut was aligned always to the people he was surrounded by, that he grew up in. And that was the leading edge. Another example similar to that would be, say, Mercedes-Benz. And somebody who owned a Mercedes-Benz, actually, even my current car is a Mercedes-Benz, is that, of course, my next car will be a Tesla, but that's another story. But Mercedes-Benz is created by the company for Germans. It's not created by doing research in US or Japan or China or elsewhere. It's a car created by Germans for Germans. But it turns out that in the automotive arena, here I'm not talking about the electric vehicles, so that's a technology part of it. But the Germans and what they love at the high end is leading edge for the world. And so therefore, It's like Mercedes-Benz for Germans and Apple for Silicon Valley habitants, if you will, that those are leading edge ecosystems rather than niche ecosystems. So that's something to keep in
mind. All right. Okay. Somebody says here, for the sake of clarity, we have seen diverse definitions in literature of what a business model is. Some focusing on the results as being monetary in nature, others focusing on it as a set of assumptions. What really is a business model by your own definition?
Yeah. So to me, the business model is really answer to three key questions that I was talking about earlier. What customers do we want to serve or do we choose to target? It's not that we would refuse other customers if they come to us, but who is my target customer? Because it's the target customer I keep in mind as I build my business, build my strategy. Second, what customer value do I want to deliver to these customers? And third is how am I going to create and deliver this value? Now, the other two things are what I would say, in some sense, related to these three parts, but not the core. So one is assumptions, because how do I decide what customers I should target or what customer value I should deliver, or how do I deliver that value? It's based on a set of assumptions, and those assumptions could be right or wrong. But the assumptions are not the same as the critical choices that I make based on those assumptions. The other part is that these choices that I make, what customers, what value, how to create that value, obviously all of that has to have economic viability. So I have to look at the financial implications, the economic implications. And the economic viability need not be commercial viability, because, if you're Tesla, you want to be commercially viable, or Apple. But on the other hand, if you're Khan Academy has always been free. So therefore they cannot have commercial viability, but they have philanthropic viability in terms of support, for example, from the Gates Foundation and so on. So you need to have economic viability of the business model. But the core of the business model are answers to those three questions based on certain assumptions and subject to economic viability.
All right, sir. I want to take an important question here, and it has to do with the oil and gas. I think this will be helpful for people. And this person says the oil and gas companies needed to pivot urgently due to the current economic crisis. Oil prices are tanking and the energy transition. However, larger, more complex organizations have a more difficult time pivoting. What approach will Prof Gupta recommend for a larger company on how most effectively to quickly pivot to avoid becoming obsolete? Now, this person is talking about one of the large oil and gas companies in the country.
Yeah. So, I think, unfortunately, perhaps for the industry, is that the long-term future of the oil and gas industry does not look very promising, because the world is moving towards renewables. I think, I listened to the most influential capital markets news channel in the US is CNBC, which of course is global and also in Africa. The most, let's say, respected anchor on CNBC is Jim Cramer. And Jim Cramer has been hammering away for the last couple of years. He's been a bit too stark, but basically fossil fuel is dead, okay? And his argument is that the investors, the analysts on Wall Street who actually move money, they grew up in a generation where they basically have embedded in their minds about the importance of environment. And so therefore, they refuse to recommend investments in fossil fuels aside from consumers. So that's number one. Second is, obviously, as Tesla has indicated, because transportation is the single largest consumer of oil. And as Tesla has indicated, that it is in fact possible to make electric vehicles that are not only cooler, but actually less expensive now, less expensive to buy than a combustion engine vehicle. And Model 3, for instance, the next year, Model 3 prices will be below average for all US cars in terms of prices, okay? And it's going down because that technology becomes less expensive over time. So the die on that is cost. The question now is, if you're a big oil and gas company, how do you deal with this? Okay, so it's a big challenge, but a good example of that comes from India, because Reliance, Reliance Industries used to be called Reliance Petroleum. It's one of the largest, maybe the largest. It's not so much an oil explorer. They do have oil and gas blocks, but their big business has been refining, and they're one of the largest oil refining companies in the world. Maybe the largest, but one of the largest. And within a period of 6 years or so, they have shifted dramatically. Okay, dramatically. In fact, they were rated by Fortune magazine as the #1 change maker in the world. They have shifted from oil to data. And Reliance Jio now is the largest tech company, digital tech company from India. They're not in tech services as in like Infosys or Wipro and so on, but they are now have a Reliance Jio itself, a new company, if you will, over 6-7 years, has a market cap of about $100 billion, okay? Created from scratch. And they are destined to be an Indian Alibaba, an Indian, Tencent, if you will, and already about more than $20 billion of investment has come in to Reliance Jio. Over the last 3 months, in the middle of the pandemic, from the likes of Google and Facebook and the big Wall Street private equity firms and so on. So therefore, that's an example of a big oil and gas company that has shifted from one sector to another sector, but done it in the context of a large company.
All right. There's a question, a practical question. Somebody who says they're working for a massive cement company, and if I can find this. All right, I work in manufacturing and we produce cement. It's a perfectly competitive industry. Commodities are similar, prices are similar, markets are similar, production lines are similar, sales strategies are similar, even employees are similar. Lots of cross-carpeting takes place. How do you craft a winning, innovative, and hard to imitate business model in such an industry?
Yeah. So all of that, what you said is very, very true. But even in industries like cement, there are two possibilities to, let's say, achieve differentiation. Okay. Of course, commodity industries, firstly, before I talk about how to achieve differentiation, that even in commodity industries, it is possible to create a sizable competitive advantage. And that advantage comes from really if you can figure out how to have lower cost. Because commodity industries like cement are price competitive. The market dictates the prices, no individual company can. But if your cost structure can be even a few percentage point lower in some type of a non-imitable way, then you have the same prices as everybody else, but significantly higher margins. Walmart did it in retailing. Cemex did it in cement. So that's one thing to think about. But at the same time, there may be possibilities to have a differentiation advantage, maybe, which is, for instance, in cement, because customers are typically not individuals, but contractors. And for the contractors, they don't want, and to be, of course, storing cement in some warehouse, they want cement at the construction site. And at the construction site, they don't want the cement to come either too early or too late. Because if it comes too late, their project is getting held up and there is cost of time. Or if it comes too early, then they have to store it somewhere on site, and that could be problematic or costly. So therefore, can you build a mechanism in terms of that, let's say, for instance, from the time you get the order from the contractor, that you're able to indicate, and obviously you need to have a good technology-driven logistics system, you're able to indicate a 30-minute window during which that cement will be delivered. Okay, and you agree on that, and that you are able to live by that promise. If you can do that, you solve a big headache for the customer. And if you can figure out a technology-driven solution to do this, you actually have solved a significant problem, big headache for the customer, and achieved an advantage for yourself. So those would be the kinds of things to think about. Can you build a cost advantage? Like Nucor. And in fact, just a good example of that is, steel. And here we are talking about not sheet steel for cars, but construction steel, which is the commodity end of a very commodity type industry. US Steel used to be the market leader, the biggest steel company in the world. And Nucor Steel entered the steel industry in 1968. No difference in the product, but they figured out how to have a lower cost structure in a way that US Steel was basically, locked into the old large integrated mills. And by year 2000, Nucor had become the #1 steel company in the US, bigger than US Steel, in a hardcore commodity industry. Okay, so there, is there a way to achieve a lower cost? Is there a way to create a differentiation advantage, not in the product, but maybe in the logistics, the timing of when you can deliver? So those would be some things to think about.
All right, final question. I'm just going to take this one. And this person says, most of the innovative business models in Nigeria have achieved, now this is based on what this person is saying, very limited scale. From your experience, what are the most important considerations to ensure that such businesses achieve large scale operations there, that they achieve large scale operations?
Yeah, so in fact, that is a very, very interesting question. Because the same problem I have seen bedevil startups in India, many startups in India that look very innovative, but then they peter out, not because the original idea wasn't very good, but they simply did not scale up. Okay. And so what happens is, actually, two of my good friends at Stanford, Huggy Rao and Bob Sutton, so they wrote a book called Scaling 3-4 years back. And the central idea there, which has been said before, they just wrote a book about it, is that if your business model is overly complex, that's going to slow you down. Okay, so simplicity is the key to scaling. And so, of course, at some point, you need to add more product lines and more customer segments and all of that. But if you add that too prematurely, it's essentially going to become like a dead weight around the neck and it prevents the rocket from taking off. So that's number one. Now, the other part, which is, we can say maybe part of simplicity, is standardization, right? So I gave earlier the example of zipline, the drone-based delivery of essential medical supplies to remote corners in Rwanda. And what they did is that even the drone itself is all the components in the drone. It's a very modular design, so that if any one component fails, they just have to, it takes a minute or two to replace that component. So standardization or modularization, what it does, that it enables you to expand to new countries, to new, first new parts of Rwanda, to new countries. So this kind of a simplicity and standardization. The third thing I would add is that obviously if the business model is not scaling, there is some constraint that's getting in the way. To identify what the constraint is and to systematically, if you will, try and eliminate the constraint. Because, there are lots and lots of ventures I know where, I got 100 customers, I got 1,000 customers, but then I couldn't go beyond 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 to, a few million. And that's the problem, is because too complex, not standardized, not paying attention to the constraints that are getting in the way of scaling.
All right, sir. Think we have done. I want to thank you so much for your time. We've gone over the hour by about 10 minutes. We need to let you go. Thank you so much, Professor Gupta. I'm sure we'll call back on you for our October 1st program. Thank you
very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and a pleasure to be with all the people in the audience.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.